Good morning, everyone. And thank you for joining us for the IGF Open Forum on forum number 71. Hopefully you're all at the right place. It says Advancing Rights, Respecting AI Governance and Digital Inclusion through the G7 and the G20. And I'm just going to start off by speaking a little bit about the objectives of this session and locate it a little bit in the AI-driven and data-driven context that we find ourselves in. But as we find these data-driven technologies, such as AI, rapidly becoming general-purpose technologies, and data-driven solutions, such as digital public infrastructures, infusing contemporary economies, public services, and civic spaces, or at least hopes of it being able to do so for many of our countries, global cooperation is required more than ever to mitigate not only the heightened risk and amplification of existing inequalities, but also ensuring the better distribution of the opportunities that are associated with these advancing technologies. Despite growing attention from multilateral fora such as the G7 and G20, AI policies, as has been shown through the GDC processes and through the AI governing humanity work done through the Tech Envoy's office, that global majority countries are often excluded from meaningful participation, and particularly multi-stakeholder participation in these processes. And these are the countries that are most impacted by AI-driven change, and which are at least represented in these decision-making processes that are emerging formally within the UN, but of course also through the emerging economies leadership of the G20 over the last 3 or 4 years. I think very importantly from the Indian G20 process, we've now got the legacy of digital public infrastructures, which has emerged as a critical area of governance that will require more integrated data governance and in order to get the best and optimal outcomes out of these infrastructures, and of course to deal with post-pandemic economic and social reconstruction that many of our countries continue to be dealing with in an increasingly volatile geopolitical situation, and in some ways make us feel further than ever from achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, which are all of our objectives. So just for this session, we are hoping that we have a lively discussion here, and we urge you all to step up around the table. We won't make you answer any questions. You're welcome to listen, you're welcome to participate. There will be opportunities to do so, and we look forward to that. And we're hoping that from this we can feed into processes that are trying to leverage the leadership within the G7 and within the G20 over the past few years, and to bring some of these processes together in terms of addressing some of these big global challenges that we face. We're going to be drawing from insights from Brazil, the very successful leadership of the G20, and certainly a mainstay in the integrated digital transformation agenda from India, Brazil, and now, of course, South Africa. I think they will be joining us there they are. Okay. So we have a wonderful set of panelists with us. I'm going to ask them when they first speak just to locate yourselves a little bit more in the international relations or policy side, or where precisely you fit in here. But just for your affiliations at the moment, we have Alison O'Byrne. I'm not sure if I've got that quite right, but please correct. Who's the Director of International Communication and Internet Policy Innovation, Science and Economic Development at Canada. So a lot on your plate. And then we have Mlindi Mashalogu, who's the Deputy Director General in the Department of Communications and Digital Technologies in the Government of South Africa. And we have Eugenio Garcia, who's the Director of Science, Technology, Innovation and Intellectual Property at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you so much for joining us. And then we've got Sabanaz, who's Rashid Dia, who's also the co-convener of this session and will be speaking shortly after me and introducing some of the issues around the T7 and G7. I'm going to start right away by asking Sabanaz, please go ahead and speak to us about the potential of the G7 to be leveraged with the G20.
Thank you, Alison, and good morning, everyone. I am Sabhan Rashid Dia. I'm with the Tech Global Institute. We are a Canada-based not-for-profit that focuses on digital rights and policies for the global majority. So it's a really interesting place to be, kind of, seeing the developments in G7, closely following the G20, and then really trying to understand how all of this fits into the priorities of the global majority communities that we serve around the world. So I think I'll just start off by saying that Canada has really inherited the G7. There's a bit of a echo on the side, I'm not sure, but has inherited the G7 presidency from the very successful Italian chairship. And at a time when really the world is facing a number of different kinds of challenges, right? There's obviously, in addition to the geopolitical situation, we're also seeing increasing funding cuts for the not-for-profit sector and the broader human rights and civil society movements around the world. We're seeing an increasing trust deficit between the global majority and many of the Western allies, and we're seeing increasingly this move towards techno-sovereignty that threatens the promise of the open, interoperable, and free internet that we all kind of are working for here today. So kind of keeping all of that context in mind, and I'm also a senior fellow with CG, who is the T7 co-chair, but I'm speaking here on behalf of TGI. I think there's a couple of different priorities we see the G7 presidency can really champion that would really bring together the various equities that we see around the world today. So I think the first one that's really important, from a non-state stakeholder perspective, would be data flow with trust. And this is really building on the Hiroshima principles from several years ago, but currently in the world today, because of the increasing pressures of whether it is, the race to the bottom for AI, or this need to establish sort of national boundaries around how we think about data ownership, data rights, we're seeing a movement where increasingly having localized data centers, localized data framework, or data governance frameworks becomes increasingly more popular, often at the expense of the free, interoperable, and open internet. And so, although currently there really isn't, while there are some principles here and there really isn't a strong global, multilateral agreement around data flow with trust. There has been different models of it, which has been quite fragmented. But I think, and we believe that in terms of, just building on what we saw with the Hiroshima process, Canada really has a strong opportunity to be able to pull together a multi-stakeholder process in which we co-develop shared principles for data flow across geographies, across regions, across different kinds of economies, and build towards a trustworthy transfer framework that could really speak to the open, interoperable, free internet, open, interoperable, and free internet that we all care about. And this really is kind of grounded on, and what I want to emphasize is oftentimes when we think about data flows, it really gets tied into national security and privacy. But I think Canada, with its position, really has the opportunity through its G7 presidency to be able to move forward with also a data flow with trust framework that's grounded in international human rights law. And so kind of combining privacy, national security, lawful access of data, which is underpinned by strong international human rights frameworks. So the second one on that sort of list of priorities is really around democratic oversight of public infrastructure. And that really ties in the G20's sort of priorities around digital public infrastructure. Increasingly, again, we're seeing a lot of shift towards ownership of local infrastructures, or increasingly where infrastructure is owned by the broad private sector, oftentimes they are not prioritizing public interest. And so again, through Canada's presidency, and I think this is also a recommendation from the T7 communique from CG, is really focusing on the kind of reimagining or bringing together the public sector, not only as a regulator, but also a market shaper. And in that way, beginning to think through what does a decentralized infrastructure look like, what does infrastructure with trust look like, and an infrastructure that really can tackle concentration of power, but at the same time, builds in those public interest elements and has strong democratic oversight. And the third and last one that I think we are prioritizing, and we hope the G7 presidency prioritizes, is really around targeted investments that really looks into building AI capabilities, particularly through a very regional and sectoral level interventions. And by that, what we're looking at is really for the Canadian presidency to center digital inclusion as one of its key pillars. And again, this was also recommended through the T7 communique, but as a key pillar in which we're trying to understand that not all countries in the world are on the same stages of AI development. But then what does a targeted investment in this particular space look like that builds towards these shared principles of privacy, for human rights, of trust across the governance ecosystem, and kind of really underpinning these investments in strong multi-stakeholder processes and consultations where we can see communities that have historically been left behind to become part of this overall global change. And I think Alison also raised key points about AI being, AI offers great opportunities, but it also can be a great amplifier of digital divides. And so really this is a key area where strong targeted investments, both in terms of building out whether it's regional coalitions or regional sort of multilateral processes, or it is looking at specific sectors, for example, health and agriculture, which has tremendous opportunity to be accelerated through AI, and making investments that are very much looking into the needs of the developing world and is able to bring together various priorities. And so those are some of the areas where we see a lot of opportunity for the G7 to work together with the G20, given those are shared principles and shared areas of priorities. And I hope we can discuss more of this in the panel. Thanks. Over to you, Alison.
Thank you so much. I'm going to speak a little bit now about the South African T20 process, but also just to say that Research ICT Africa, which I'm the Executive Director and represent here, is also a knowledge partner to the Department of Communications and Digital Technologies, who lead the Digital Economy Working Group, and the AI Task Force on Data Governance, data innovation and sustainability. And so have been very much seized with South Africa's themes during the presidency of equality, solidarity and sustainability. These are long-standing themes on the continent. They're very central to our African Agenda 2063, and of course to our digital transformation strategies as well. I'm going to, of course, leave Melindy to speak to the specifics on the G20 agenda, but just to speak about the integrated digital transformation strategy that we have been following with G20, or we've been involved with the G20, which has really tried to consolidate the emerging economy leadership of the G20 and really take forward from each G20 these important aspects that are somewhat come with a different lens on some of those issues. So just very quickly to speak to some of these important crosscuts that you have on free flow of trust and fragmenting internet and these sorts of things. There have been very interesting discussions within the G20, which are obviously still underway, and there's no consensus on these sorts of things, but certainly a number of the policy briefs, these issues have been taken up very strongly within the G20 and T20 under Brazil. So much so that data was proposed as a major initiative coming out with the T20 and C20 actually asking for a D20. It seems to be so significant. And certainly it's a very strong crosscut. The T20 agenda very much shadows the G20 agenda. It's a little bit tighter because we don't have a lot of resources, but things that we've had incredible policy inputs on equitable digital inclusion, on transformative DPI. There is another category that Melindy will speak about around micro enterprises, which is a focus of the Digital Economy Working Group. It does come up in some of the digital inclusion discussions quite strongly in the policy briefs. And then there's one on enhanced technologies and specifically AI. And I think just bringing this lens that we've had, starting with the Indian presidency, with the focus not only on DPI, but the strong focus on data for development and what that meant in that context. And just, bringing together some of the development, debates and some of the data debates, which have, largely, when we speak about the, cross-border flows and flow with trust, that these are very often conceptualized in, of course, international human rights, but within frameworks that have been focused very strongly on first generation and fundamental rights, on very individualized notions of privacy, and very often not adequate attention to some of the collective and systemic harms that result from this. Primarily, and in Africa, with over half the population not online, primarily from exclusion. So for the equitable, the digital inclusion component, both within the G20 and the T20, there's been a strong emphasis on looking at the extensive evidence we have that this is no longer, or if we're just talking digital inclusion, I'm not talking about the digital economy at the whole, which obviously needs very advanced technologies in order to flourish. But if you're looking at digital inclusion for internet purposes, the main constraints we're finding at the moment actually on the demand side. So it's not just inclusion, it's about equitable inclusion, not about people being on tiny little bits of data and eking out stuff, but actually being able to, transact and even be productive. And I think that's come out very strongly in our continental frameworks that have been coming out in our policy briefs, certainly from African scholars and contributors, researchers to that process. That obviously requires a whole lot of attention, policy interventions that have to go beyond infrastructure that we need to look at. Just in terms of returning to the free flow of trust, because data governance has been such a big crosscut. It's come up in policy briefs for DPI very strongly. The focus there, both I think within the G20, but also in the T20, and drawing I think on the G20 from previous work done on the T20, has been about extending the focus on sort of techno-legal infrastructures to really understanding the potential of DPI in terms of public value creation, balancing the focus and the shift historically on sort of supply side infrastructural valuation of resources to looking at how we can get to more demand side evaluation and allocation of resources that would produce digital commons and public goods, and actually make these infrastructures beneficial and usable by the vast majority of people who, if we just implement them right now, are not going to be able to use them. And so that actually requires us to engage, and I think there have been really exciting engagements around things that have been already accepted in the G20 before, but really located not only in the global south, but in an African context, which the presidency has been very committed to. This is an African, unfortunately our AU representative wasn't here today, but they're leading a lot of the projects on here because we've got these very strong data policy frameworks. They speak very much to redistribution, they speak very much to justice, and they highlight that you do not get, if you have free flow of trust with the current status quo, we do not have the environments that are equitably trustworthy on either side. And at the moment, the free flow of trust means we've got, or free flow, let's say we don't have trust. We have 70% of traffic going out to the continent and only 30% of data coming in. So we need mechanisms that will really allow us to redress some of these uneven impacts from the harms point of view, but also address some of the very uneven opportunities. And so in this context, a lot of interesting policy briefs around regulating access to data, regulating access to compute, and of course the important aspects you've raised of capacity building, not only for data scientists, not only for coding and STEM and that, but for institutional capacity building, regulatory capacity, new complexities that we need to deal with our existing regulators and the need to integrate them. So thank you for letting my long ramble go on, probably a little bit longer than it should have there. But let me quickly go to Alison and ask you, Alison, to speak a little bit about the priorities that are emerging around the digital technologies, these governance and some of the DPI issues we've been speaking about that have also just come out of your most recent meeting.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Thanks so much. Thanks. And as my fellow Alison just noted, so I'm Alison O'Byrne, and I'm Director for International Telecommunications and Internet Policy in the Government of Canada's Department of Innovation, Science and Economic Development. It's the industry department. I'm very pleased to be able to speak on the panel today. I think this is a very engaging discussion already. And I will say that for having had that long discussion around the T20 process, I saw that you were not using notes for that, which means that's just all right front and center in your mind, which is very impressive to me, and I think speaks to a level of passion around the work for sure. Maybe I could talk a little bit about, as you noted, some of the key priorities that have been emerging in the G7 context for this year around digital technology, digital governance, and particularly artificial intelligence. I think I'm at a distinct advantage advantage, regrettably, over our South African colleagues in the sense that our leaders meeting has already happened. So I at least get to speak to some of the points of consensus already arrived at, which I know is always more difficult when you're still in the planning process. But I do think that there are a number of priorities that came up, particularly in the context of artificial intelligence within Canada's G7 presidency this year, where we see some particular linkages to South Africa's G20 presidency, and more broadly to conversations that are happening this week and elsewhere around equity and around inclusiveness in the digital space, which I think is really valuable. You know, the G7 and the G20 will probably always approach these things with slightly different angles or slightly different approaches, but I think that there are links between the ways that we are thinking about technology and how to ensure that technology has equitable benefits to all people. In terms of Canada's G7 presidency and particularly where we've seen some of the emphasis on digital policy pieces, a lot of emphasis this year on artificial intelligence and on promoting economic prosperity for small and medium enterprises, you know, ensuring that folks have the skills, the talent, the resources to be able to effectively commercialize, effectively adopt, or effectively develop AI solutions that provide significant benefits to consumers, to clients. There's certainly an emphasis on building resilient future workforces as well. So in the skills development realm to prepare workers for AI-driven transitions. There were discussions this year at the G7 leaders meeting as well around energy challenges as it relates to AI. And of course, this comes from two different angles, both the challenges that are presented by AI from an environmental and a climate perspective, but also AI's potential role in helping us to identify solutions to ongoing climate challenges as well. And so two different kind of angles on that. And I would note as well that as part of the G7 leaders statement, there was a specific commitment to sort of engage in and develop partnerships and cooperation, particularly with emerging economies and developing countries. And so a real focus on ensuring that as we're developing technologies at home in Canada and G7 countries, that we're also looking for mutually beneficial partnerships that allow us to ensure that the benefits of those technologies are felt not just in G7 nations, but also in those emerging economies, in those developing countries as well. I think we've been obviously very pleased to see as well for South Africa as the president of G20 this year, highlighting the challenges that continue to be faced by the global majority in building resilient AI ecosystems, particularly challenges related to, you know, we discussed infrastructure, supply side challenges, but also demand side challenges like AI talent, access to data free flow, research and institutional capabilities, all those pieces that have to sort of be figured out in tandem in order to build these resilient AI ecosystems. It's an issue that's top of mind as well, as noted at the G7 Leaders Summit. And we've also, as Canada particularly, have been strongly engaged on Digital Economy Working Group, on the AI Task Force through the G20, and particularly giving consideration to how our own Canadian initiatives can support things like the AI for Africa initiative, Technical Assistance Policy Facility, how we can ensure that we are engaging in a way that allows us to take the kind of expertise and the resources that we have and apply those to international systems and to multi-stakeholder systems that then provide those benefits out kind of more equitably in the world. And I really do think that that's going to be at the heart of the work between G7 and G20 in the coming years, particularly on digital policy, is ensuring that we leverage these international processes, that we leverage our multilateral processes to be able to identify sort of consensus joint initiatives, but likewise that we leverage multi-stakeholder forums to do that too, that we bring in not just governments, but businesses, academia, civil society, to ensure that we are taking, as we say, this equitable approach to really advancing digital inclusion.
Thank you so much, Alison. I'm hoping we can come back and follow up on a number of interesting points. I'm sure, Lindy, you want to feed on to follow on from. But Lindy, why don't you just tell us a little bit about both the G20 Digital Economy Working Group, the AI pillar within there, of course the DPI pillar as well, and then the AI Task Force.
No, thank you, Alison, for that question. I think we have to recognize that, you know, as we join the G20, taking the presidency of the G20, we're one of the smallest members in terms of the economy in the G20. But also there are some challenges that we are facing, which includes like your youth unemployment, you know, digital exclusion, and some barriers to innovation. And we see that, if we bring in these realities, to the global digital discourse, especially on the areas of digital governance, artificial intelligence, and inclusive development, I think we can achieve quite more on that. But also listening to my colleague from Canada, I believe that there are some of the shared initiatives that the values that we can actually work around in terms of some of these processes. While these processes they're not really aligned or not institutionally designed to align to each other, but I think there are some common themes that we can work around. And if I can just go through our G20 presidency, it's guided by our three pillars, which is solidarity, sustainability, and equality. But also these pillars, they underpin, the agenda of our digital economy working group, where we have placed the emphasis on digital inclusion, rights respecting AI governance, as well as the DPI. So if then you look onto the digital inclusion, we see that is a foundational challenge that we need to make sure that we address. Because from the early years of the WSIS process, we've known the power of digital technologies to transform the lives of our economies. But unless we address the cost of the devices and data, scarcity of local content, the gaps in digital skills, as well as inequalities in education, each of these new technologies wave will deepen the existing divides. So we need the deliberate action in innovation on the areas of AI as well as DPI. Otherwise, if we don't address those, we'll find that we exacerbate, the digital divide that is already there. So, but that is why then, as a country and our presidency, we are prioritizing the areas of investment in the digital public goods, which is the meaningful and affordable connectivity, the public interest data platforms, as well as the foundational identity systems that empower the individuals, not just systems. But we see that these enablers these are the enablers of human rights, economic opportunity, as well as the democratic participation. When it comes to AI governance, our priority is to ensure that the systems are inclusive, ethical, and accountable. This means that we have to protect privacy, safety, as well as information integrity, but also promote representative data sets to mitigate bias and discrimination. And it's one of the areas that we've been talking about, even on the other panels in this process, that, if we have to mitigate bias, we need to make sure that all the data sets, they are inclusive of all the, the demographics in the country as well as the continent. But also we are working on ensuring that we recognize data as a public good and expanding the equitable access for researchers, SMMEs, as well as, the local innovators. And I know that this is one of the areas that is normally, a bit of a context, because when you look on the private sector players, you'll find that they see the government data as the source of innovation. But what we are saying here is that data, both the privately generated data as well as the public generated data, needs to be the source, a public good, and be used responsible to drive innovation. But also we're working on the areas of building capacity across the compute infrastructure, talent pipeline, as well as context-aware AI research. It's one of the areas also, because if you were to look in terms of the compute capability as a country and also as a continent, you'll find that we're still lacking behind on that one. So it's one of the areas that we would like to advance in terms of our presidents as well, to make sure that this fundamental infrastructure is there and it can actually assist us. But also, as I draw to the close, so we continue to work on the DPI, which was started by the Indian presidency, which is emphasizing on the inclusive and interoperable systems, open standards, as well as governance that both enables innovation and also protects the public interest. So we also believe that the scope is for deeper cross-forum collaboration is there, because if we were to look on the members of the G7, they are also the members of the G20, and I think we can exchange the best practices, align the approaches, especially when it looks on the areas of AI and data governance, but also look on how we can advance like the multilateral system, like a digital global digital compact. But most importantly, I think we must also commit into amplifying the voices of the global majority, not as implementers of external frameworks, but co-creators in the digital norms, and also shaping our shared future. Thank you, Alison.
Thank you so much, Lindy, and I think very keen to take up the points made by both of you, Alison and Lindy, on the potential for cooperation with the G7 or leveraging both those processes to take both processes forward. Before we come to that, I'm going to ask Eugenia Garcia to speak a little bit about the legacy, the G20 Brazilian legacy that very much I think we're committed to and building on, but also to speak about how we ensure that, I think it was regarded as such a successful presidency. How do you make sure that those legacies continue, that that you are able to continue to forge the progress made and the gains made in these multilateral processes going forward once the presidency is over?
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I think one of the first challenges that we faced when, in the beginning of our presidency of the G20 last year, was to define the priorities, especially for the digital economy working group within the G20. And we talked about this with our Indian colleagues because they did an amazing job in terms of bringing DPI into the discussions of the G20, and we also share the similar concerns. And of course, in Brazil, we are trying to improve digital public services, and etc. And but our approach was always trying to see how developing countries can make a meaningful contribution in digital technologies. So we decided in the end that 4 priorities would be our suggestion as the Brazilian presidency of G20. The first, universal and meaningful connectivity. Because of course this is an old issue, but we still have many digital divides. 1/3 of the world's population is still offline. So asking about global south countries, there is a lot that we need to do. So this was one of them. The second was precisely DPI, because we were also convinced that this was an important issue, and it would be nice to have some continuity from the Indian presidency with the Brazilian. Next, information integrity, but this was new, so we didn't know exactly how other members would react, if we would reach consensus, or they would like testing the waters, because for us it was a top priority, information integrity in the digital domain. And it was the first time that this issue was brought to the table in the G20, and we were successful because we reached an agreement in the ministerial meeting held in Maceió, which was September last year. You can also download the Maceió Declaration from the ministers, that you see the language adopted on information integrity. I think it was also important, and we were successful in this regard. And the fourth priority is artificial intelligence. So, but because not only people are talking about this, but we see AI as an opportunity to boost development towards a more equitable future, fostering innovation, enhancing productivity, advancing sustainable practice, and concretely improving the lives of people everywhere on the planet. And of course, to achieve this goal, the global governance of AI should mitigate potential risks and address the needs of all countries, including from the global majority. So this was more or less the idea that AI should be development-oriented and contribute to reducing inequalities. I think it was the basic approach. And we also proposed during the presidency the creation of an AI task force. And so now we are glad to see that we have the task force thriving during the South African presidency. So I think this, in terms of lessons learned, this is key, because we need to first ensure a smooth transition between the presidents, because that was a happy coincidence, because from India, Brazil, and South Africa, I think you might remember an initiative called Ibiza Dialogue Forum. It was created in 2003 to promote South-South cooperation. It's a group bringing together India, Brazil, and South Africa, precisely. So as three large developing countries, all democracies, and from three different continents, and also sharing similar concerns and challenges, so especially in terms of the global digital ecosystem. So this helped a lot for this smooth transition, because when we finished our presidency, our foreign minister in Brazil received a South African delegation, precisely to share our experience with them and see how we could guarantee that some of the issues that we brought would also have a continuation. And I think we were both successful as well. But for this to happen, we need political will. For example, let's say, what about the follow-up from these discussions within the G20 regarding other international organizations or international initiatives? Because after the G20, now this year we had with the presidency of the BRICS in Brazil. So, and we also brought AI as a key point to discuss within the BRICS, drawing from this experience in the G20. Of course, they are completely different groups, but our approach was basically the same, that AI should be development-centered. And so, and another point is that also we have COP30 coming next November in Brazil, in Belém, the first ever COP in the Amazon rainforests. So when we say information integrity, we were in the beginning trying to understand the possible reaction from G20 members. But in the meantime, we were in conversation with the United Nations Secretariat, in particular the Department of Global Communications and UNESCO. And when we had the summit of the G20 in Rio, we launched a global initiative on information integrity and climate change. You see, they have the connection between the G20 and the COP30. So I think this, connecting these dots, you need to make a conscious decision to ensure not only the smooth transition, continuity, and having the political will to follow up in a very concrete way. So this global initiative on information integrity and climate change has been launched, and now we are working with a call to action, a road to Belém, where the COP30 will be held. And I think this was very helpful. In general, we are very happy with what South Africa is doing in terms of moving forward with these topics, including in terms of the digital economy working group of the G20. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much for that, and I'm sure that Lindy wants to pick up on some of those points, but I'm going to go to the room, go forward to the room. I think the important point that you made, or Lindy made first, that we had to kind of pare down our ambitions, maybe not our ambitions so much, but what we could achieve. And so there's a kind of a little bit more limited agenda. And one of the things that I think sort of went to everybody's maybe regret, but I think it's been picked up, is the information integrity issue. And it's just been so overwhelming that it's come up anyway. And again, in these crosscuts, there is a focus on generative AI and deep fakes that has had an incredible response from member states, but has really picked up the issue of information integrity, although not formally on the agenda. So I'm sure we're going to pick up some of those discussions. But I'm going to ask you to respond to questions from the floor and online, and then also do those responses to each other, please. So let's start with the room. Who would like to? Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
This has been a really interesting discussion so far. I have more insight into the G20 process. It's good to know that there are a lot of synergies, not just between the G20 presidencies, but also between the G20 and the G7. I was wondering if you're aware of any points of contention between these two processes, and if you could speak to those and how we can address them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a great question. Right. Maybe we can do the online? Yep. Right. Can the online moderator hear me?
Hello, yes.
Hi. Have you got any questions to pose to the panel?
No, we do not have any online questions yet.
Okay, all right. Well, we'll just take that one question from the floor, but please indicate, let's take it, we've got another one from the floor. And then while people are responding, if there are any more from the floor or online, please let me know.
I'll be the sole questionnaire here. I'm a doctoral student from Iceland studying how very large platforms are undermining democracy, with AI, of course, playing a large role in that. What I have found in my studies is that there seems to be a lot of gaps between high-level discussions and policies and our aims and practicalities. Now, I have 30 years working experience in IT, so getting the input, training the people, integrating into computer science courses, etc. How are we sort of meeting the industry, meeting the people who are actually going to execute our policies? How would you recommend going about that? Where can we put our efforts so we get the most out of our efforts? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And another question from the floor?
Thanks. My name is Liz Orembo from Research ICT Africa. Now, my question is about the continuity of presidency from one country to another in the G20, as well as synergies. Now, South Africa's presidency comes after 4 Global South presidencies, and I'm curious about what are those concerns from the Global South that have been taken from the first Global South presidency, leading to a complete troika leadership from the Global South, and now South African presidency? And also tied to that, what new agendas or new concerns is South Africa putting forward to the G20, given that this presidency is not just a Global South also presidency, but also an African presidency? Thanks.
Thank you so much for that question, Liz. Perhaps if just we can add one question that I was expecting to come from the floor, but maybe also for us to address, is that obviously in terms of the processes of the G20 and the G7, we have this troika format because these bodies don't exist. They're not standing bodies and they have to be reconstituted each time. So this provides some of this continuity that we spoke about, can be so politically important in terms of continuity, but also, of course, can present issues if there is not alignment. And I suppose this is geopolitically a tricky time to be doing this multilateral work because of its enormous dependency on cooperation and common values and those sorts of things. So perhaps just because we've got so little time, just to, in your responses, maybe also just speak about the importance of the G7, G20 collaboration in this geopolitical context. Alison, I'm going to ask you to start off again.
A danger, of course. I think the first question was whether there are points of contention between the G7 and G20. No, never. I'm kidding. I think as we think about the sort of various questions that were presented, points of contention between G7 and G20, how we ensure a level of continuity across presidencies in either group, and how we ensure a level of continuity between the G7 and G20, I would say a couple of different things about that. One is that I think, and it's easy for me to say this, governments have an enormously difficult challenge when they face the presidency of either the G7 or the G20, because there's a significant amount of pressure internally within the government, both to deliver new sort of hallmark initiatives, so to kind of put your own stamp on the presidency and to deliver something that really stands out and is unique and brings something new to the group, while also having a level of continuity from previous presidencies. You don't kind of want to wipe the slate clean and start all over again. And so you end up in this real challenge that, if you went on forever, you could have an ever-expanding agenda of different items to discuss, and it just becomes too messy, and sometimes you kind of have to trim things back. So that is always the challenge, I think, that a new presidency faces when you're either in the G7 or G20 context. some of the pieces that are really helpful with that, or maybe one thing that I would really point to that's enormously helpful with that, and sometimes helpful in the scary way for governments, is multi-stakeholderism, which is to say that I think when you're a government and you're trying to decide what pieces of a previous presidency or what pieces of alignment between G7 and G20 really need to be the focus of your agenda, in addition to any kind of new hallmark initiatives that you're thinking of, when you're thinking about where that continuity needs to come, one of the places that you really look is to the stakeholder community. So if you have pieces from a previous presidency, or if you have pieces from the G20 and you're in the G7 context, where you see that there's a strong response from stakeholders, either positive or negative, it helps you to kind of situate yourself and understand what is going to resonate with an external audience beyond those kind of policymakers and the government sector, essentially. And I think it also gets to the very important question from that one of the folks in the audience asked today about, then how do we link that from the policy space to the implementation space? You know, these G7 statements, G20 statements can be quite high level and sometimes quite general. It's beautiful to have these sort of big policy aspirations, but then how in reality do we implement those things? And I think that is also some of the answer to that question, is we then look to where we're seeing outcomes from whether it's previous presidencies or new ones that really resonate with the multi-stakeholder community, because it gives us an indication that there's probably mechanisms that we can use then and partners that we can have to actually implement those ideas, so that they don't just remain ideas in a statement, but they actually become practical, implementable policies.
Great, thank you so much. I think a lot probably to build on there. Sumela, just to ask you, please, if any questions do come in online, just to give us an indication, but I'm going to continue getting some responses to the questions we've had here.
Yeah.
Lindy, will you like to respond? And of course to your panelists as well.
No, thank you, Alison. No, I think if I can just start quickly on some of the questions, especially the one that came with the doctoral student there. I think one of the things that we see is sometimes, us as policymakers, and, when you look on the people on the ground, you find that there is a bit of a disjoint, to how we normally do things, and there is a level of a lack of public participation on some of these processes, and it's important that, as policymakers, we start to go to the communities so that they understand and, how we actually get to a particular decisions. And I think from our G20 presidency, I've seen, how some of the private sector players have been coming to observe, the work that we do, and to see how we normally actually get into, a particular declaration, and how hard it is to actually get into a particular declaration. So it's one of the things that I think we need to start doing. But also in terms of, what my colleague from Canada, mentioned, in terms of, the continuity, that, there are some areas of impact that you would like to see as a particular presidency, either from a G20 or G7. And sometimes it becomes a little bit difficult, to continue with the continuity sometimes, but sometimes you'll find that you can actually, push through some of the areas. But I think in terms of the continuity, I think one of the areas that we can actually look into is to look on the broader aspects, and if we were to look both in the G7 and G20, if we see, the areas that we can build a multi-year initiatives, that each and every presidency will continue, while you might have, some other different initiatives that you would like to achieve. I think that would work, and you'll find that, most of the work that we'll do will continue, on the other presidencies as well. But also, I think, because also you'll find that this work that we're doing, it goes to the other, global platforms as well, that are doing the implementation capacity. So I think if you feed these statements towards, the implementing, platforms, then I'm sure that, these initiatives can actually be advanced, at international level, as well as the multilateral stakeholders as well. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lindy. Eugenia, perhaps we can get a quick response from you. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I think for improving relations between G7 and G20, we need to explore areas of convergence, first of all, because particularly this year, the political environment at international level is became more complex, let's say, with growing polarization or geopolitical tensions, ideological divides. And you see that President Lula was invited to attend the G7 in Canada, and he brought this message because it's easier said than done, of course. Let's cooperate, but since we are hosting COP30, climate change is one of the issues that he brought to the table in terms of concerns with sustainability globally, but also energy security. And all these challenges need international cooperation. So I think if we are able to see how the G7 and G20 can coordinate better, exploring the converging areas of where we can have concrete initiatives or perhaps discuss and being at least on the same page in some of these issues that are really essential for all of us, I think that's the way we should try always to move in that direction.
Great, thank you so much. Sumela, do we have any online questions?
Yes, there is one from Jamieson Wisen. So it reads, Shabnam, we heard the need for decentralized DPI, and from Ellison, we have heard the need for multi-stakeholder engagement, and we often find open source software can help power both. Would love to hear your reflections on the role of open source or digital public goods for cooperation and DPI.
Okay, that's such a big question and so many things. I'm going to ask Shabanaz to respond to that, and then I'll just give everybody, if there is time, if we can keep it, then I'll ask everybody just if they want a quick comment on that too and close off. Thank you, Shabanaz.
Thank you. It is a very big question, but I think increasingly, one of the ways, DPI is obviously becoming increasingly important across the G20, but also, across other forums that we're part of. For example, the Freedom Online Coalition, we're also discussing quite a bit about DPIs. And so increasingly, the promise of DPI is moving infrastructure from the private space to the public spaces and really reimagining governments as sort of not just regulator, but also sort of shapers of market. And I think there's a real opportunity there. But in terms of just open source, DPI models, perhaps, the biggest promise is the fact that it's not a proprietary model necessarily, and that there's a lot of opportunity in terms of open source in different elements. So for example, whether it's going to be the underlying code, whether it is the switch, whether it is some parts of the data. But I think the real promise of DPI is to be able to lean on really a long legacy of open code principles, open source sort of principles in terms of ensuring that DPI is able to fulfill its promises in terms of being a truly public interest technology and truly be able to tackle some of the market consolidation issues that we see.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to give the panelists, starting with Eugenio, if you want to just have one last comment, please go ahead.
Yes.
If we can keep it to 30 seconds.
Final remarks. I think, as I said, we were happy to have India, Brazil, and South Africa in terms of cooperation, South-South cooperation, also securing this smooth transition that I mentioned was essential. And I hope we can learn from this experience as a group and also help others for the next presidencies of the G20 and see how we can also be creative, but also fostering cooperation that we need we need right now to address some of these global challenges.
Yeah. Alison, please go ahead.
Absolutely. Maybe two quick points. One is to just echo what I think Eugenio was talking about during one of his previous responses, discussing the sort of need for G7 and G20 both together and in their distinct forums to really focus on areas of convergence. I think it really speaks to the need to recognize that these groups have a fundamental role in really reflecting our underlying humanity, the places where we all come together, things like climate change, things like digital infrastructure, where we might be affected as countries in different ways, but where we all have equities and we all have to really work collaboratively in order to solve those intractable challenges. And as a very last point, of course, we had a slightly strange G7 year this year with an election in Canada in the first half, so there's more to come on our G7 presidency. We've got ministerials through the fall and some additional interesting digital work that I'm sure will be coming up in the coming months.
Yes, it's been an interesting 6 months all round, I think,
Yes.
globally. Lindy.
I think, Alison, I think on my side, I just want to emphasize, the need, to advance, the digital governance as well as AI, and to understand that these are not just technical issues and challenges. They are fundamental about the inclusion, equity, as well as shared responsibility, and also the choices that we make today will shape, our future for generations. But also from the G7 and G20, I think it's important that we build an open right space as well as people-centered digital world, that leaves no one behind. And I think these processes can, work together, to challenge some of the deeper challenges of the world. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sabina.
Thank you. I think I just want to build on one of the points that Alison mentioned in terms of the multi-stakeholder processes. I think, we as not-for-profits, civil society, think tanks are able to work across different processes. And we have been part of the G20 process from the India presidency. We've been part of the ASEAN negotiations, some of the early BRICS conversations, and now some of the G7 conversations. So I think leaning on your multi-stakeholder allies, leaning on your non-state stakeholders allies are really a really powerful way of building that convergence across different kinds of political processes and finding ways in which, because we live in this complicated geopolitical moment, to really find those commonalities across humanity.
Great. Thank you so much. I think I'm not even going to try and sum up the very interesting conversation we've had here, but I think there have been some very strong common themes around how we can leverage these multilateral processes through multi-stakeholder participation to deal with this moment in time, this poly-crisis that we are facing, use these different processes and between these different processes, so the things that are happening between these processes as well, to reinforce them and make sure that the incredible gains that have been made, I think, over the periods that they have existed, and particularly over the last period since COVID and during COVID, and since COVID, to deal with some of the crises that we face at the moment. So let's take that forward. A lot of work for both the G20 and the G7 until the end of the year. Thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you very much to Smela for online moderation. And thank you very much to the audience.